The Berlin morning was heavy with silence when the police arrived at the small apartment complex in Treptow-Köpenick, a quiet neighborhood far from the chaos of the city center. The August air carried a strange stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside one of the buildings, behind a pale blue door marked with the number 34, the life of a young woman had come to an unimaginable halt. Maria Fernanda Sanchez, a 24-year-old Mexican student who had come to Germany chasing dreams of creativity and education, was found lifeless after days of desperate searching. The scene was heartbreaking, her workspace still cluttered with notebooks filled with handwritten poetry and half-finished ideas, her laptop open to an unfinished email, her phone lying inches away as if she had been about to reach out one last time. Neighbors stood outside in quiet disbelief. Most had seen her only in passing, often smiling, sometimes walking briskly with headphones on, a coffee in hand, blending seamlessly into the city's rhythm. For them, she was just another young soul finding her way in a foreign land until the news broke. And her name became a headline that traveled across continents. The police cordoned off the area, their radios murmuring softly while forensic teams moved with careful precision, capturing photos, collecting evidence, searching for a story hidden between the walls. It was clear from the beginning that this was not just another case of disappearance, it was the unraveling of a life full of promise, now clouded by mystery. In Mexico, her parents waited with trembling hands, their hope battling fear as every hour passed without news. Online, her friends flooded social media with messages, hashtags, and prayers, turning her disappearance into a global cry for help. But now, as investigators pieced together the final hours of her life, that hope had turned into grief. The city that had once promised her new beginnings now held the echo of a tragedy no one could explain. There were no signs of a struggle, no immediate clues, only unanswered questions and a haunting quiet that settled over her room. Her dream of studying communication design in Berlin had been bright. She had written often about feeling inspired by the city's art, the colors, the freedom, and yet, something in those final days had dimmed that light. Detectives would later describe the atmosphere as calm but sorrowful, an impression that stayed with them long after they left the apartment. Outside, the press had already gathered, camera shutters flickering like restless fireflies. Narrating a story that was both deeply personal and heartbreakingly universal, a young woman, far from home, whose story ended too soon. The tragedy of Maria Fernanda Sanchez wasn't just the mystery of her death, it was the reminder of how fragile dreams can be, how loneliness can quietly wrap around even the brightest souls, and how the search for meaning in a foreign world can sometimes lead to heartbreaking silence. Berlin's grey skies mirrored the weight of the investigation that unfolded in the days following the discovery. The small apartment on Morikestris became the center of a quiet storm, police vehicles lined the narrow street, journalists waited behind barricades. And neighbors spoke in hushed tones, afraid their words might somehow disturb the fragile truth that investigators were trying to uncover. Inside, the forensics team worked methodically, documenting every inch of the space where Maria had spent her final moments. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no chaos that hinted at an intruder. Her belongings were neatly arranged, a testament to her orderly personality, and yet, something about the room felt frozen in time, as if she had simply paused mid-thought and never returned. Detectives examined her messages, call logs, and digital footprints, hoping for a clue that could explain the sudden stillness that had replaced her once vibrant presence. They found recent conversations with friends back in Mexico, notes about her classes, and a few journal entries filled with reflections about homesickness, the pressure of studies, and the challenge of building a new life far from home. It was the portrait of a young woman who, like many others abroad, carried both ambition and vulnerability in her heart. Outside the confines of the investigation, her disappearance and death sent shockwaves across two countries. In Mexico City, candlelight vigils appeared almost overnight. Friends from her university held posters with her smiling photo, her eyes bright and full of life, demanding answers and calling for justice, though no one yet knew what justice would mean. On social media, her name became a movement, Maria Fernanda Sanchez, shared by thousands who had never met her but felt connected through empathy and outrage. The Mexican embassy in Germany coordinated with Berlin authorities, ensuring transparency and cultural sensitivity in the handling of the case, as the story grew too large to contain. Journalists from both sides of the ocean scrambled to piece together timelines. When was she last seen? Who was the last person she spoke to? Was there something in her final posts that hinted at despair or fear? Each question led to more speculation, and each speculation deepened the mystery. Police spokespersons issued brief statements, cautious and professional, emphasizing that the investigation was ongoing and that every possibility, from accident to self-harm, was being examined. Yet behind those calm words, investigators privately wrestled with the silence left behind. There were no witnesses to her final hours, no signs of a struggle, and no evidence pointing toward another person's involvement. For her loved ones, the ambiguity was unbearable. They clung to every update, every rumor, every possibility that might rewrite the ending they were being forced to accept. In her neighborhood, locals left flowers by her door, small candles flickering beneath the window where she had once sat sketching designs late into the night. To them, she was no longer a stranger from another country. She had become a symbol of shared humanity, of how easily someone full of dreams can vanish into tragedy. As days turned to weeks, the Berlin police slowly released their findings, ruling out foul play but acknowledging the emotional complexity surrounding her death. Still, questions lingered not only about what had happened inside that apartment, but about the broader reality of isolation faced by young people who leave everything familiar behind in search of opportunity. In that reflection, Maria's story transcended borders. It became not only a case but a mirror held up to a generation navigating loneliness, ambition, and the invisible pressures of survival in an unfamiliar world. As the news of Maria Fernanda Sanchez's death spread beyond Berlin, the world began to take notice. What had started as a missing person alert shared among friends quickly transformed into a global conversation about safety, mental health, and the invisible struggles faced by students living abroad. Major media outlets picked up the story, first in Mexico, then across Latin America, and eventually throughout Europe. Her photo, a portrait of youthful ambition and quiet confidence, became instantly recognizable, a reminder of both promise and fragility. On social media, her name trended for days as people from every corner of the world shared her story with messages of solidarity and sorrow. Yet, beneath the outpouring of empathy, there was also a collective unease, a sense that this tragedy spoke to something larger than one life lost. Commentators began to ask hard questions. How does a bright, hopeful young woman, with friends, talent, and opportunity, end up alone in a foreign city, her light extinguished so quietly? What could have been done differently? In Berlin, students organized small gatherings near the Technische Universität, where Maria had been enrolled in a postgraduate design program. They held her photos in candlelight, their voices trembling as they shared memories of her kindness and her love for art. She was always smiling, one classmate told a local reporter. She talked about colors the way some people talk about music, with emotion. The atmosphere was heavy but united. Maria had, in her absence, brought people together who might never have met otherwise. Across Mexico, vigils continued. Parents, students, and teachers gathered in universities holding candles and handmade signs, many reading Ni una más, not one more. It was a phrase already heavy with meaning in Mexico, but this time, it carried a global echo. Maria's story wasn't just about crime or mystery, it was about the silence of suffering that often hides behind smiles and ambition. As journalists dug deeper, a more nuanced picture began to emerge. Maria was described by those who knew her as thoughtful and introspective, sometimes quiet, but full of compassion. She had dreamed of living in Europe for years, and when she finally made it to Germany, she had shared her excitement with family and friends, posting photos of cobblestone streets, design projects, and her cozy apartment filled with sketches and sticky notes. But behind the bright photos, some close friends noticed subtle signs of fatigue and loneliness. She had written about missing home, about how winter felt longer than she expected, about how sometimes the city's silence made her feel invisible. None of it seemed alarming at the time, just the usual adjustment phase every international student faces, but after her death, every word seemed to carry new weight. Mental health experts joined the public discussion, emphasizing how isolation, academic pressure, and cultural disconnection can quietly erode a person's well-being. The conversation turned from blame to understanding, from tragedy to awareness. Meanwhile, investigators continued their work quietly. Although no signs pointed to foul play, they still examined every possibility, re-interviewing neighbors, checking surveillance cameras, and consulting with psychological experts to reconstruct her final day. It was clear that the authorities wanted not only to close the case but to handle it with care, aware that the world was watching, and that this was more than just an incident on paper. The Mexican embassy praised the cooperation, but also reminded everyone of the human side of bureaucracy, that behind every report, there is a family waiting for closure. Maria's parents, still in shock, expressed gratitude for the outpouring of love yet pleaded with the media to respect their daughter's memory not as a headline, but as a person. She was light, her father said during a televised interview, his voice breaking. She had dreams, and she wanted to make the world more beautiful. That's what she was doing in Germany. His words touched millions, reigniting conversations about the vulnerability of those who leave home to pursue their dreams abroad. As days passed, murals of Maria began appearing in parts of Mexico City and Guadalajara, colorful tributes painted by strangers who felt her story deep within their hearts. Poets wrote verses about her. University groups organized mental health awareness campaigns in her name. In Berlin, one of her classmates placed a small notebook in the courtyard of the university, inviting students to write messages for Maria. Within days, the pages were filled, some in German, others in Spanish, English, and even Arabic, words of love, empathy, and grief written by people who had never known her personally but felt connected through her story. Her tragedy had transcended borders, languages, and cultures. It had become a symbol not of despair, but of shared humanity. In the weeks that followed Maria Fernanda Sanchez's passing, her story rippled far beyond the borders of Germany and Mexico. It was no longer confined to newspaper columns or nightly news updates, it had become a global reflection of something deeply human. Universities in Europe began hosting forums about the psychological challenges faced by international students, while mental health advocates in Mexico launched online campaigns using her name as a symbol of awareness and empathy. Behind every smile, there can be a silent storm, one campaign read, its words shared across thousands of profiles. Maria's story struck a chord because it felt painfully universal, the struggle to belong, to prove oneself, to adapt in a world that demands resilience even when the heart is breaking. Social media, often a place of noise and division, became a space of unity, filled with stories of others who had felt similar loneliness in foreign cities. Some spoke of long winters without family, others of the quiet anxiety that comes from chasing perfection in an unfamiliar language. For many, Maria became the voice they never found the courage to use, her silence amplifying theirs. Journalists, mental health professionals, and cultural commentators began connecting the dots between Maria's experience and the invisible pressures that define modern youth. They wrote about the culture of constant achievement, the digital illusions of happiness, and how easily one can feel unseen in a crowd of millions. In talk shows and podcasts, experts discussed the paradox of globalization, how technology brings people closer, yet isolation remains one of the century's most common afflictions. Maria's death, though deeply personal, had sparked a broader reckoning, a conversation about empathy, connection, and the need to check on those who seem okay. Her classmates in Berlin described how they began reaching out to one another more frequently after her passing, forming small circles of care where people could speak openly about their struggles without judgment. Professors started including mental health discussions in orientation programs for foreign students, recognizing that academic brilliance means little when emotional stability is lost in the process. In Mexico, the reflection took on a more emotional form. Parents saw their own children in Maria, sons and daughters who had gone abroad to study, full of dreams, unaware of the quiet risks that come with distance and disconnection. Public discussions on television and online focused on how families can support young people abroad without overwhelming them, and how institutions can provide better safety nets for international students. Psychologists explained how cultural transitions, language barriers, and the absence of familiar emotional anchors can create feelings of invisibility that often go unnoticed. For a society that has long associated success with leaving home and making it abroad, Maria's story became a sobering reminder that emotional well-being is just as vital as achievement. Meanwhile, in Berlin, her apartment remained sealed, a silent monument to what had been lost. The flowers left by strangers were now replaced by laminated photos and small notes written in multiple languages. Some said, "You are not forgotten." Others simply said, "Dank, Maria," as if thanking her for sparking a conversation that needed to happen. Local community groups began organizing walks dedicated to mental health awareness, while Mexican students in Germany created online networks to support each other emotionally and socially. For them, Maria's legacy became a call to action, to look out for one another, to build bridges of understanding, and to never underestimate the quiet pain behind polite smiles. As the months passed, documentaries, podcasts, and independent journalists revisited her story not to sensationalize, but to humanize. They focused on her creativity, her intelligence, her laughter, the parts of her that deserved to be remembered beyond tragedy. She was more than a case, one Berlin-based filmmaker said. She was an artist, a friend, a dreamer. The tragedy is not just how she died, but that we realized too late how much she was carrying alone. Those words resonated deeply, becoming a reflection of how society often glorifies independence while overlooking the silent cries for connection. Maria's story, retold countless times in articles, classrooms, and art installations, became a quiet revolution, a reminder that behind every tragic headline lies a complex, beautiful, and fragile human story that deserves understanding, not judgment. By the end of the year, when the cold once again settled over Berlin, a small group of her friends gathered near the River Spree, where they released white lanterns into the night sky. As they rose slowly, their lights flickering against the darkness, it was as though Maria's spirit was home not to a place, but to the collective memory of all who had come to know her story. Her tragedy had turned into testimony, her silence into a shared promise, that no one chasing their dreams should ever feel alone in the process. Months after Maria Fernanda Sanchez's passing, what had begun as mourning slowly transformed into a movement of meaning. Her name, once whispered through tears, became a symbol of awareness, connection, and resilience. In universities across Germany and Mexico, her story was shared in lectures, student workshops, and art exhibitions that explored the silent weight of mental health. Professors began quoting her journal entries, lines filled with raw honesty about identity, belonging, and the pressure of perfection, to remind students that brilliance and vulnerability often live side by side. Her classmates, determined to turn their grief into purpose, organized an annual event titled Lucy's Para Maria, Lights for Maria, where students would gather to discuss the realities of studying abroad and the importance of emotional openness. During the first event, the crowd stood in candlelight as soft music played and stories of personal struggle were shared freely, without shame. It was not just a memorial, it was a movement. People cried, hugged strangers, and for the first time, many spoke aloud about feelings they had hidden for years. In Berlin, cultural centers and student associations began collaborating on projects that combined art and advocacy. One installation featured hundreds of paper butterflies, each carrying a handwritten message from students around the world expressing what they wished they could tell someone when they felt alone. At the center of the display was a simple plaque with Maria's name and the words, "You are seen." Visitors often left in silence, tears in their eyes, reflecting on the fragility of the human spirit. Local newspapers covered the event not as a crime story, but as a testament to the power of empathy. It marked a shift. The public no longer remembered Maria solely for her tragic end, but for the light her story had ignited in others. Back in Mexico, the Sanchez family became gentle advocates for awareness, choosing compassion over bitterness. They began working quietly with mental health organizations to create programs for students preparing to study abroad. "We cannot change what happened," her mother said in an interview, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But if her story can save even one life, then Maria's journey will not have been in vain. Their courage inspired countless others who had suffered loss to speak out and push for better mental health resources. Mexican universities, in collaboration with European institutions, launched initiatives focused on psychological preparation and support systems for international students. They called it the Maria Fernanda Initiative, dedicated to ensuring that no young person would ever feel completely alone in a foreign land again. The art world, too, embraced her legacy. Emerging designers began dedicating exhibitions and digital art pieces to her memory, exploring themes of identity, distance, and emotional resilience. One particularly powerful piece displayed at a Berlin gallery depicted a map of the world made entirely from scattered sketches, symbolizing the thousands of students who leave home each year, searching for belonging in distant lands. It was both beautiful and haunting, echoing Maria's own journey. Critics praised it as a rare blend of artistry and empathy, a reflection of how tragedy can be transformed into a message of hope. Art heals, the artist said softly at the exhibit's opening. And through Maria's story, we are learning how to listen. Meanwhile, online spaces that had once buzzed with grief now became communities of care. Support pages formed on social media, offering advice, counseling links, and open chat groups where students could share their fears and find comfort in shared experience. Many of the participants were young women who saw themselves in Maria, ambitious, far from home, trying to prove their worth in unfamiliar worlds. They began writing blog posts and essays under hashtags like #ForMariaFernanda, focusing not on her death but on her dreams. She wanted to design things that made people feel, one post read, and now, through her story, she's still doing that. Even within the Berlin Police Department, the case left a quiet mark. Officers who had worked on it later attended community meetings and mental health forums, admitting that the experience had changed how they approached similar cases in the future. "We learned that not every tragedy needs a villain," one investigator said. "Sometimes, the fight is invisible and our duty is to see what others cannot." It was a rare moment of vulnerability from law enforcement, showing that Maria's story had touched hearts even within institutions built on discipline and procedure. By the end of the following spring, a scholarship fund was announced in Maria's honor, supporting Mexican students pursuing design and art studies abroad. It was funded by private donors, artists, and former classmates who wanted to keep her dreams alive. The announcement ceremony took place both in Berlin and Mexico City, connected via livestream. As her parents spoke, the crowd stood in silence, their eyes glistening with emotion. "She came to Germany to learn about art and design," her father said. But what she truly left behind was a lesson in humanity. Those words echoed far and wide, printed in newspapers, quoted in essays, and shared online, a testament to the enduring power of her spirit. By the following year, Maria Fernanda Sanchez's story had become more than remembrance, it had become reform. What began as a wave of grief evolved into a structured global effort to protect and support students living abroad. Universities across Germany quietly reviewed their mental health and wellness systems, many admitting that their previous frameworks had focused too heavily on academics and bureaucracy, while overlooking emotional well-being. Orientation programs were redesigned to include mandatory mental health briefings, peer mentorship systems, and bilingual counseling options. Maria's name appeared on many of these initiatives not as a case study, but as a symbol of compassion. Posters hung in university corridors read, "In memory of Maria Fernanda, reach out, stay connected, never stay silent." For thousands of students arriving in Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg, her name became part of their first introduction to the city, a gentle reminder that their voices and struggles mattered. In Mexico, her influence took a different but equally powerful form. The government, in collaboration with higher education institutions, introduced new programs designed to prepare students emotionally and psychologically before leaving to study abroad. These sessions covered not just paperwork and visa requirements but also topics like homesickness, cultural shock, and maintaining communication with loved ones. "We learned through Maria's story that leaving home is not just a physical journey, it's an emotional one," said one university counselor during a televised interview. Non-profit organizations also stepped forward, launching nationwide campaigns emphasizing the importance of checking in on friends and recognizing early signs of emotional distress. Billboards appeared in major cities reading, "Talk to someone. The silence hurts more." Although they didn't mention her name directly, everyone knew who had inspired the movement. The collaboration between Germany and Mexico deepened as embassies, educational ministries, and NGOs worked to build a more supportive network for international students. Cross-cultural training was introduced for student advisors, focusing on empathy, diversity, and communication. Annual mental health conferences were held alternately in Berlin and Mexico City, bringing together psychologists, educators, and policymakers. Each event opened with a moment of silence for Maria, followed by discussions about how to continue improving. In these halls, her presence was felt not through sadness, but through purpose. "We cannot undo what has happened," one German official said at the first conference. "But we can ensure that her story becomes a bridge, one that connects compassion with action." Beyond institutions, artists and storytellers continued to spread Maria's legacy through creativity. A short documentary titled The Distance Between Us premiered at a Berlin film festival, following the lives of 5 international students navigating the emotional complexities of living abroad. Though Maria's story inspired it, her image was never shown out of respect, but her essence was everywhere. In the words, the imagery, the moments of quiet reflection. Critics praised the film for its honesty and sensitivity, calling it a work that transforms mourning into meaning. The documentary later aired on streaming platforms and became a teaching resource in universities. At the same time, social media evolved from mourning spaces into proactive communities. Under hashtags like #StudyAbroadSafe and #InMemoryOfMaria Fernanda, people shared guides on mental health resources, helplines, and coping mechanisms for students far from home. Former classmates of Maria even developed an app that allowed international students to anonymously connect with mental health professionals in their native languages, a digital lifeline for those too afraid to speak out. Within a few months, the app had thousands of users across Europe and Latin America. In its welcome screen, a single message appeared: "You are not alone." It was a simple phrase that carried the weight of everything Maria's story had come to represent. In classrooms, educators began using her story to start conversations about empathy and community. Professors encouraged students to look out for one another, to ask, "Are you really okay?" and to listen to the answers. The narrative had shifted entirely. Maria was no longer remembered solely as a victim of tragedy, but as the catalyst for an international awakening about mental health. Her name symbolized not loss, but transformation. Even the media changed its approach. Where once sensationalism had dominated headlines, journalists now revisited the case through a lens of respect and reflection. Articles highlighted systemic progress, featuring interviews with experts and families affected by similar experiences. The tone was no longer one of pity or shock, but of growth, acknowledging that tragedy, while devastating, can also ignite empathy and reform. As one columnist wrote in a widely shared editorial, "Maria's story taught us that empathy must not come after tragedy, it must be part of how we live." As the first anniversary of her death approached, both Mexico City and Berlin prepared quiet ceremonies. Candles would again light the night sky, but this time, there was no sense of despair. Instead, there was resolve, a collective promise that her light would never fade. Maria Fernanda Sanchez had left behind more than memories. She had left a movement that crossed oceans, cultures, and generations. In her absence, she had built bridges the living had long forgotten how to build. Exactly 1 year after that quiet August morning in Berlin, the world once again spoke Maria Fernanda Sanchez's name, but this time, it was not through tears. It was through gratitude. Across 2 continents, people gathered to honor her memory, her art, and the powerful change she had inspired. In Berlin, a soft drizzle fell over the streets as hundreds of students, teachers, and locals made their way toward the River Spree, where a small stage had been set up surrounded by candles and photographs of Maria's smiling face. The air was cool, but filled with warmth, the kind that only human connection can create. Her classmates, now graduates, stood together holding paper lanterns, their reflections dancing in the water as the city lights shimmered behind them. Some read poems written in her honor, others performed songs she used to love. "She came here to study design," one of her friends said softly into the microphone, "but she ended up redesigning our hearts." The crowd fell silent, not out of sadness, but reverence. It was as if for a moment, Berlin itself paused, acknowledging a soul that had quietly changed its rhythm. At the same time, thousands of miles away in Mexico City, a parallel ceremony unfolded. In the courtyard of her former university, a mural depicting Maria surrounded by vibrant colors, blues, yellows, and golds, stood proudly against the evening sky. Below it, candles flickered beside hand-painted signs that read "Por Maria, why por todos los que luchan y en silencio, for Maria, and for all who struggle in silence." Her parents stood hand in hand, surrounded by students, journalists, and officials. When her mother spoke, her voice carried across the courtyard with steady grace. "My daughter taught me," she said, "that the heart travels farther than the body ever can. She is not gone, she is everywhere compassion is found." The crowd responded with applause, some crying quietly, others smiling through their tears. It wasn't just an act of mourning, it was a declaration of life, resilience, and the enduring strength of love that transcends borders.